when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And I think that we need to have our eyes wide open to what might be happening in the US at the moment. Do we want to cozy up to a authoritarian, potentially fascist US government, or do we want to turn towards our European neighbours and work with those whom we largely share values and share goals, and we could work together for the benefit of people in the UK?
Carla Denyer, welcome to PoliticsJOE.
Thanks for having me.
It's such a pleasure. This is your first appearance in studio on PoliticsJOE, right, but we've had you before. I'm sure the audience know who you are, but how would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Carla Denyer. I'm one of the 4 newly elected Green Party MPs. I represent the constituency of Bristol Central, and I'm also co-leader of the Green Party with my colleague Adrian Ramsey.
Brilliant. We're here to talk about your proposal to the Chancellor about a wealth tax. But before that, I think we should comment on the events in America yesterday. Do you think Elon Musk did a Nazi salute?
I struggle to see what else it was if it wasn't a Nazi salute, and I think we should all be very worried. There's a saying, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And I think that we need to have our eyes wide open to what might be happening in the US at the moment. And I think this is a pivotal moment for the UK government, a pivotal moment for the UK government to decide which way it's going to turn. Do we want to cozy up to a authoritarian, potentially fascist US government, which would undoubtedly put us on the outskirts of Europe even more so? Or do we want to turn towards our European neighbours and work with those whom we largely share values and share goals, and we could work together for the benefit of people in the UK?
Is that assessment of Europe still accurate? I'm talking about Le Pen, Meloni, Orban, the insurgent far right in Germany, Austria. It's just been booted out in Poland, which is obviously a positive. But the EU that we talk about now isn't the EU of the 2016 referendum. So is that turning from a rock to a hard place?
That is a fair point. Unfortunately, the rise of the far right is not a uniquely American phenomenon. But I still think that the situation in Europe is substantially less bad, and that there are plenty of people and governments that the UK government could and should be working with. And I think, obviously, as co-leader of the Greens, I'm focused on offering the positive alternative to people who are rightly frustrated by being let down, feeling rightly that life has got harder over the last 10, 15 years in the UK. You know, many of the people who are voting for Trump in the US and are considering voting for reform in the UK, they've often correctly identified some of the problems, but then the likes of Farage are offering them solutions that sound promising, but are too easy and are about scapegoating the wrong people who are not actually responsible for the mess we're in. So as Greens, we want to be really clear about, accurately defining what the problem is. Yeah, our public services are terrible. Yes, it's really difficult to get a doctor's appointment. Our schools are crumbling around our kids. That's because of political choices made over the last 15 years to systematically underfund public services, substantially by people who support privatisation of public services, because you know what, systematically underfunding public services is a great way to then argue for privatisation being the only solution. So we need to accurately label what's going on and then present solutions that will actually fix the problem. And that's where my letter to Rachel Reeves comes in, saying, look, public services, whether it's the NHS, schools, local councils, have been systematically underfunded. They are being expected to deliver more and more with less. And let's be honest here, this isn't a 1 to 2% efficiency savings. Wouldn't have a problem with it if it was that. This is 40% cut in funding in some areas. There is no way that that's being done by efficiency saving. That's being done by directly cutting services. And I'm really worried that, far from recognising that the political decisions of the last 15 years have in part led to the rise in popularity of the far right because people are fed up with the political status quo, Rachel Reeves is talking about potential further cuts to public services. When we have a really unequal country here, we shouldn't be cutting services that most people rely on. We shouldn't be increasing taxes on the majority of working people and on small businesses, but we could be introducing a tax on the very, very wealthy who can easily afford to pay, who've only been getting wealthier over the last few years. That could make a transformative difference to our economy. And while I, as the co-leader of the Greens, can keep championing those policies, and believe me, I will, ultimately it is up to this Labour government, if they want to stop and reverse the rise of the far right, they need to make the policy decisions over the next few years that will make sure that people feel looked after by this government.
He's rolled back his support now, I would say, but were you concerned when Elon Musk was suggesting, there were suggestions that Elon Musk would donate £100 million to reform? How did you feel about that entire debacle?
£100 million is an enormous number. That's about 4 times what's ever been donated to reform before, many times higher than the largest donation any other UK political parties have received in one go. It would enormously distort the political system here in the UK. And I'm glad that the threat of this happening, which seems to have abated for now, has put the issue of political donations, and foreign political donations especially, on the public agenda. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about this, because this is something that the Green Party has long been concerned about and has long challenged and said we need a fairer and better regulated way of funding political parties so that they are not vulnerable to the corrupting influences of a small number of very, very wealthy people who can effectively buy a political party or buy an entire democracy. That said, it's on the political agenda. It is not on the government's agenda. Mm-hmm. This weekend, just gone, Lucy Powell, the leader of the House of Commons, said that there are no immediate plans to review regulations around foreign political donations, and I think that is extremely concerning.
Why do you think the government doesn't have that on their agenda? Because it's something that's obviously it's urgent, you might say. Like if Elon Musk can decide to dangle £100 million in front of any political party in the UK, it's not just on reform, but they've gone for reform.
Well, his preferred politician seems to be Stephen Yaxley-Lennon now, which is even more concerning.
No, exactly. And so you can influence, a foreign national can influence these things. Do you think the government just doesn't grasp how urgent this issue is?
I mean, there's a whole range of reforms to our democracy that are long overdue. Reform to our voting system, scrapping the incredibly unfair first past the post system, which a majority of Labour Party members support, and yet the Labour government, because many of the members of it benefit from Labour safe seats where they don't have to campaign very hard to get elected, haven't caught up with their membership. So there is a long laundry list of well overdue reforms to our democracy in the UK that Labour are dragging their heels on. Interesting fact, interesting/depressing, is that the UK Labour Party is the only Labour or Social Democrat party in Europe that doesn't support proportional representation. All of their sister parties across Europe see it as an integral part of a social democratic political mandate. It's an essential part of creating a fairer society. And that is why we are still left as one of the few countries in the world that uses this outdated, unfair system. In fact, there's only one other country in Europe that uses first past the post, and that's Belarus. Not exactly a club that we want to be part of. So yes, I'm afraid I am looking squarely at the Labour Party when I say we are in this unfair, unequal democracy where the vast majority of people are not well represented and don't get the balance of politicians that they want because Labour has blocked it. And I'm worried that they're doing the same on political funding, because an unfair voting system plus an unfair funding system is a toxic cocktail. In this election, even though Labour got a huge mandate in some senses, in that they have a huge majority in number of MPs, actually a lot of people didn't get their votes represented. Many campaign groups, many democratic campaign organisations, have frequently pointed out that as our political system in the UK evolves, as we move away from being a two-party system, first past the post represents people less and less, and it's no wonder that people who don't see their votes resulting in political representation, it's not excusing it, but it's not terribly surprising that they're then being drawn to extremes in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Are you comfortable with, if the UK was to enact some sort of proportional representation, if it was a direct party list system, right, then, and it's proportional representation on a national level, Reform would have far more MPs than they do at the moment? Is that something that you would be comfortable with?
It's obviously not an outcome that I want, but I think there are sort of a couple of counter arguments to that. Mm-hmm. One is that I think that the level that Reform is polling at the moment is in large part an angry reaction to the feeling of being ignored by the establishment parties. If we had a fairer democratic system where people could get some representation for their views, I think that polling level would go down substantially. I think it would be vanishingly unlikely that a far-right party would be able to get into government. Not impossible, and we must, we mustn't dismiss that possibility. We must be alive to it. But in general, a fairer voting system makes it harder for extremes to get into government, because it is more likely to generate, it will generate a spread of MPs that more accurately represents views in the country. And it is less likely to generate whopping majorities for one party, which means that parties must work together and cooperate. Despite the rise in the far right, we have seen in a number of European countries parties cooperating to stop the extremes of the far right. Sometimes it means that not everyone gets exactly what they want, but it generally helps to make sure that the policies that serve the most people possible in the country and is more likely to be achieved. No system is perfect, but a fair system in terms of number of votes matching seats is more likely to ensure that people's views are heard.
The fall-off in the government's popularity since the general election has been quite staggering, and we've seen kind of the correlation of the rise in support for Reform. Obviously, there is dissatisfaction with this government. Do you have a sense of why these people are being attracted to the Reform Party and the right, and not the left and the Green Party?
Well, in the Greens, we have seen an increase in support and in membership.
It's marginal compared to Reform.
I'll grant you that it is not as much as the recent, huge increase in support for Reform, which, as I said, I think we should be worried about. And I think that it is because now that they're in government, Labour do not seem to be, in many areas, offering the change and the hope that people voted for them for. And so voters are understandably feeling frustrated that what was the point in voting for Labour if what they're offering isn't a whole lot different from the last 14 years of Conservatives. And that's where I have to return back to that feeling of disenfranchisement, the decades of cuts to public services, meaning that nothing works anymore. Mm-hmm. It's so hard to get access to the services you need. If we fix that, if we make those bold decisions around asking those with the broadest shoulders, asking the billionaires and multimillionaires who can easily afford to pay a bit extra so that we have properly working public services that we can all benefit from, I really think that is what the majority of people in this country are crying out for. They just want things to work properly, goddammit. And that requires bold decisions in terms of the economy. One of the things that I think is really important for us to remember is the economy isn't some kind of naturally occurring force of nature that we mere mortal politicians just have to sit back and allow to happen. The economy was designed by humans to serve us as society, to meet our basic needs. That means that if there are elements of the economy that aren't working very well, we can design them differently. And the Chancellor, I think, would do well to be a little bit braver. The budget, I wasn't the biggest fan of her budget, but it wasn't all bad. One of the things that I liked in it was the increase in capital gains tax. That's something that I and the Greens have been championing for years before the general election was in our manifesto. We would have liked to have seen capital gains increase to the same level as income tax. So just to de-jargonise that for a minute, before the election, the amount of tax you pay when you make money from selling assets was less than the amount of tax you pay for going out to work every day. Now, given that if the majority of your income is coming from selling assets, you are by definition rich, very rich, I don't think it's at all controversial to say that the very rich should be paying the same tax on their income as everybody else. Mm-hmm. So I was pleased to see Rachel Reeves increase capital gains tax, but she still hasn't increased it to the same level as income tax. So she is still saying that the rich should pay less tax on their income than everybody else in that respect. So I think, there's only 4 of us Green MPs so far. Touch wood, hopefully that number will increase. It's more than there
used to be.
But it's more than it used to be. And I do think that you can see our fingerprints a little bit in some areas of what the government is doing, and that is probably one of them. Because the fact that we were championing an increase in capital gains tax for years before the election, I think did cause Rachel Reeves to be asked in interviews and elsewhere, why won't you consider it? To the point where it became too embarrassing not to consider it. Now, I'm realistic about how much influence we can have with 4 Green MPs, and that's why I very much hope we can increase our number at the next election. But with the environment as it is, with the rise of the far right, with the climate crisis staring us in the face and the nature crisis too, we can't afford to wait till the next general election in 4.5 years or whenever it is to start achieving that change. So we'll be doing everything we can as Green MPs in the meantime to push the government in the right direction on the economy. And so I'm pleased to have seen some small improvements like capital gains, but they're still keeping the Tory 2-child benefit cap. They're still refusing to consider wealth tax. There's lots of other areas where I'd like to see improvement, and I'll be pushing for it.
You mentioned the wealth tax there. That is what we actually wanted to discuss. You wrote a letter to the Chancellor, which you brought a prop.
I did.
You're not allowed to use them in Parliament. So I'm surprised. Well, in the real world, of course, you can use whatever props you want. You could bring in like juggling balls or something, even if you wanted to get your message across. Can you talk us through your argument as to what a wealth tax is and why you think that the government should introduce one?
Yeah, that's right. So I wrote to Rachel Reeves last week because I was really concerned just before Christmas to see that the financial settlement for local councils. So councils receive a proportion of their income from council tax and a proportion from national government. And over the last 14 years of Conservative government, the amount of funding available to local councils has gone down and down and down, even though they're expected to do more and more and more. And that's the cause of so many of our public services crumbling in this country. And a lot of people had a lot of hope that a Labour government would fund local councils properly so that they could deliver those public services. But we already saw the signs that wasn't terribly likely before the election. In an interview, Rachel Reeves was asked and explicitly said she'd not be overall providing any more funding than the Conservatives had done. But I'm not taking one no for an answer. We have to keep up the pressure. The local government settlement just before Christmas, it's probably not fair to describe it as an austerity budget in that it doesn't deepen austerity. I.e. deepen cuts to services, but neither does it pull councils out of them. It feels like the aeroplane has been heading worryingly towards the ground, and she has pulled up the nose just enough to stop councils crashing into the ground this year. but not enough to get them fully out of this mess. And we're seeing that with councils of all political stripes saying that they are seriously at risk of bankruptcy over the next few years. And I'm not going to point fingers and blame particular councils under different political leaderships for that. You can run a council more or less effectively, but ultimately this is because of an unsustainable financial settlement for 15 years now. And I really think that Rachel Reeves has other options, and it's disappointing that she's ruled them out. And one of those is a wealth tax. So there's an organisation called the Patriotic Millionaires, which is a group of millionaires and billionaires who are saying, please tax us more. Because they recognise that if you want a country, an economy, a set of public services that work well, you have to pay for them. And they have commissioned research that has shown that, contrary to what we might expect, actually a large proportion of the UK population, including a large proportion of the very wealthy, are supportive of increased taxes on the wealthy, and specifically a wealth tax. So that is a tax on their savings and assets rather than on their income. So that's an area that isn't taxed at the moment. And the reason I think this is very compelling is that while the UK is a very unequal country generally, the area in which the inequality has been growing over the last few years is not in income, it's in wealth. Because when you have wealth, that tends to generate more wealth, whether you're a huge landlord with hundreds of properties. You have that wealth, that brings in income, so your overall wealth increases, plus the property values increase, and so on and so forth. So by putting a modest tax on only the very, very wealthiest who can easily afford to pay, the Patriotic Millionaires model suggests a 2% tax only on wealth that you hold above £10 million. So that is only the top fraction of a percent of the UK population. And they get their first 10 million free. You know, it's a really modest amount, 2% over the 10 million only. That has the potential to raise around £24 billion a year, which would have a transformative effect on public services.
I think people would be staggered to learn about the funding gaps across the country. I reported from Birmingham, and Birmingham City Council declared bankruptcy last year, and there was it was pretty devastating. There was all these cuts to services for people with quite severe disabilities, and the services that allow them to go out and kind of just like live their lives and not just be stuck at home, and the taxes that take kids with special needs to schools, things like that. Your home city of Bristol Council faces a £52 million
That's right.
funding gap. Why do you think Rachel Reeves isn't being as imaginative as this?
It seems to me that Rachel Reeves and the Labour government more broadly are... they think that the way to beat the Conservatives and Reform is to be more like them, even though the polling shows that that doesn't work. That just boosts the right-wing parties and drags our whole politics in that direction. So I think out of a desire to be seen to be financially responsible, what Rachel Reeves is actually doing is making a series of short-term decisions that in the medium and long term are very financially irresponsible, because when you let services crumble, you force people into destitution, you force them out of work. If they've got a long-term health condition or a disability, for example, they're not getting the public services they need. They might not be able to work when they would be able to otherwise. They might get sicker. That puts more pressure on the NHS. Healing people who are very unwell costs a lot more than preventing them getting ill in the first place. So many of these decisions, if you let things crumble and get bad and broken, they will cost so much more to the Treasury than preventing it from getting like that in the first place. And that's why the Green Party is all about investing in a way that in many, many cases would save money in the long run. Climate is another obvious example. Everyone from the Office of Budget Responsibility to Oxford University and dozens of other organisations have all said that investing in stopping or at least reducing climate change now is many times over cheaper than dealing with the consequences of accelerating climate change, as we're already starting to see.
The Green Party is a party of big ideas, popular ideas like that. Why is there a disconnect between that idea is popular? Why are we not seeing the Green Party gaining popularity and momentum?
Well, we're working on it.
Yes.
So I would say, of course, I would like to see the Green Party doing better. But we have quadrupled our representation in the House of Commons. We have more than quadrupled our number of local councillors over the last 4 or 5 years. We have hundreds of times more councillors than Reform do, for example. And we are in administration in dozens of councils, so we're actually delivering policies to make people's lives better directly. In terms of why the popularity of our policies hasn't always translated to getting Greens elected, until recently, I think that was because people, because of our unfair voting system, were afraid that it was a wasted vote. And I can understand that. But as we have seen this growth in the number of councillors and in the number of MPs, and let's not forget we came second in 40 constituencies as well as coming first in 4, we've got a record-breaking vote share across the country in this general election. A lot of people have seen that actually, if they want green policies, they've been let down too many times by other political parties promising them green, economically and socially fair policies and then dropping them when the going got tough. If they want those policies, they need to vote for the Green Party and get Greens elected. And they're increasingly seeing that is how it works. You know, in places like Bristol Central, Waveney Valley, where Adrian, my co-leader, is elected. In North Herefordshire, where Ellie Chown's unseated Conservative MP, coming from the previous position of 4th place for the Greens. And we achieve that by working really hard, recognising that we're a small party at the moment. We have to really focus our efforts on a relatively small number of winnable seats. With the amount of funding we had, if we'd spread that evenly across all 575 seats in England and Wales, we'd have got nobody elected. So we did have to focus our efforts on a handful that we could win. Hopefully, if we have more people joining the Green Party, getting involved, donating a bit of money if they can afford to, we can target a much higher number of seats next time around. That's certainly my goal. But I think the level that we're polling at the moment as the Greens, so kind of around 9 or 10%, usually, that is how people are minded to vote in this unfair voting system, and with the belief that in most places the Greens can't get in. When we demonstrate that actually the Greens can get in a wide variety of different kinds of constituency across the country, I think that polling will go up as people realise that they can vote with their hearts. And as you said, there are so many policy areas where the Green Party's policy is the one that's really popular, and yet we're the only party with that policy, whether that's around public ownership of public services, around wealth tax. There's lots of points where, and this isn't us saying this is independent polling, showing that these policies are widely recognised to be common sense. They're not particularly political. And so we see our job as really pushing the Overton window and putting pressure on the government especially and other parties to come with us and see that that's what makes sense, what's cost effective, and what helps meet people's needs.
Lewis Goodall on this very channel said that the Green Party was too nice. What do you make of that criticism?
I didn't see that interview, so I don't know in what context it was.
So the context was we were kind of talking about the discrepancies between Reform and
I thought it might be.
and the Green Party, and talking about how we're in a new age of like political almost communications, and that Reform and Nigel Farage can command the news agenda by tweeting a video of Nigel Farage talking about the Southport riots or whatever it may be. And I think I'm going to have to assume a couple of things about Lewis's analysis, but he was suggesting that you were almost playing by the old rules, as we won't sully ourselves with that, and it was perhaps to your disadvantage. What would you say to that?
Thank you for providing that context. That was what I suspected was going on there, that it was in comparison to reform. And that's a question that I'm often asked. Why don't you use more of reform's tactics? Well, there are some ways in which we could. Maybe I could do more videos on social media, talking straight down the lens. I did one this week. There are other ways in which I'm definitely never going to do that, like using dog whistle racist rhetoric in order to scapegoat people who are absolutely not responsible for the situations we're in this country and economy. So if playing nice means not being a racist, then yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But I do recognise that as Greens, I wouldn't say we play by the old book. You know, we are one of the younger political parties in the UK, and many people, including myself, joined the Green Party precisely because we were frustrated with the way Labour and the Conservatives operate, with this sort of chummy old boys club in Parliament. That is completely the opposite of how I'd like to see our politics work. And the Green Party was set up and I joined it because I wanted to shake things up. So I don't recognise the description of me playing by old political rules. But I do accept the criticism that sometimes we get a bit sort of wordy and policy wonky. You know, we sometimes get into the policy detail a little bit too much rather than zooming out and communicating effectively. Never mind the details of the policy, what's it going to do?
Is that something you're cognizant of as leader and something you're trying to change?
Yes, absolutely. So my background is in engineering, and I think it's fair to say I'm quite a details person. And so I do sometimes need to be reminded to zoom out and to talk about the bigger picture a bit more often. I think in the Green Party we have got a bit better at that over the last few years. Our leaflets that we would deliver during local elections used to be pretty wordy. They are now a bit less wordy, which we've tried to make them
pamphlets rather than tomes
a bit easier to glance at, so you don't have to sort of sit down with reading glasses for 10 minutes to know what it is we're getting at. I think that would be a fair criticism, and it is something that I'm keen to get better at.
Carla Denyer, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.